The howl of the Montana wind carries secrets. Some say if you listen closely enough, you can hear the whispers of those who came before, tales of heartbreak and triumph etched into every snowflake. This is one such story of a schoolteacher's courage, 2 abandoned children, and a man whose scars ran deeper than the ones visible on his face. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The blizzard descended on Pine Creek without mercy, transforming the quaint Montana town into a prison of white. Snow didn't fall. It attacked, whipping sideways in sheets that cut like paper against exposed skin. The temperature had plummeted so rapidly that the old-timers said it was God's own breath freezing the world solid. Rebecca Miller pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her slender frame, squinting through the wall of white. Her cottage, normally a 15-minute walk from the schoolhouse, might as well have been in another country now. The rational part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive through 35 years of hardships, told her to turn back, to wait out the storm in the school building. But the muffled cries coming from the abandoned Murphy barn at the edge of the property silenced that voice of reason. "Hello?" she called, her words instantly swallowed by the wind. "Is someone there?" The cries paused momentarily before resuming with greater urgency. Rebecca forced her legs forward, each step sinking her knee-deep into fresh powder. The barn door hung at an angle, creaking violently as gusts threatened to tear it from its remaining hinge. She squeezed through the gap, the sudden absence of wind disorientating her for a moment. "Please," came a small voice from the shadows. "Help us." Rebecca's eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the weathered planks. Huddled in the corner, buried under what appeared to be sacks once used for grain, were 2 children. A boy, perhaps 10, with a gaunt face and eyes too old for his years, sat protectively beside a younger girl whose violent shivering told Rebecca all she needed to know. "I'm Miss Miller," she said, kneeling beside them, her teacher's voice instinctively calm, despite the panic rising in her chest at the girl's blue-tinged lips. "The school teacher. What are your names?" "I'm Mason," the boy answered, chin jutting, with determined bravery. "This is Charlotte. She's my sister." "Where are your parents?" Rebecca asked, already removing her coat to wrap around the little girl. Mason's face crumpled momentarily before he reconstructed his brave facade. "They're gone. The wagon, the river. Pa tried to cross, but the ice." He couldn't continue. Rebecca understood immediately. The White Pine River crossing had claimed lives before. With spring's early thaw and refreezing, travelers unfamiliar with its patterns often mistook ice thickness. She'd heard rumors of a family attempting to cross 3 days prior, but Sheriff Simmons had reported no survivors. "We've been hiding," Mason continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Sheriff said we'd be sent to different homes, separated. Charlotte's all I got left." Rebecca felt a familiar burn of anger. Walter Simmons had been separating families for years under the guise of proper placement, a practice that conveniently provided free labor to his friends' farms and businesses. She and Walter had once been engaged before she'd discovered the kind of man he truly was: vindictive, power-hungry, and cruel to those he deemed beneath him. "You won't be separated," Rebecca promised, the words escaping before she could consider their implications. "But we can't stay here. The temperature's dropping and Charlotte needs warmth." The girl's shivering had become less pronounced, a dangerous sign. Hypothermia was setting in. Rebecca made a quick decision, scooping Charlotte into her arms, while gesturing for Mason to follow. "My cottage is too far in this weather," she explained, "but the school has a stove we can light." The trek back to the schoolhouse felt eternal. Charlotte's weight, though slight, taxed Rebecca's strength as she fought against the relentless wind. Mason trudged beside her, occasionally stumbling, but refusing her offers of help. By the time they reached the small building, Rebecca's limbs burned with cold and exertion. The schoolhouse, normally filled with the chatter of 20 children from surrounding farms, stood empty and silent. Rebecca had dismissed classes early when the storm clouds gathered, sending students home before the worst hit. Now she thanked Providence for the stack of firewood beside the pot-bellied stove and the emergency supplies she kept in her desk drawer. "Get those wet clothes off," she instructed Mason, setting Charlotte gently on a desk near the stove. "There are blankets in the trunk by the blackboard." Within minutes, she had a fire blazing. Charlotte's clothes were soaked through, her small body alarmingly cold to the touch. Rebecca worked methodically, removing the wet garments and wrapping the child in layers of wool blankets before turning to help Mason, who stubbornly insisted he could manage himself. "When did you last eat?" Rebecca asked, retrieving her lunch pail with half a loaf of bread and some cheese she hadn't touched. "Yesterday morning," Mason admitted, his eyes fixed hungrily on the food. "We had some jerky pa left in his pack, but it's gone now." Rebecca divided the food, giving the larger portions to the children. As they ate, Charlotte's color gradually improved, though her eyes remained dull with exhaustion and grief. Mason maintained his vigilance, watching the door as if expecting Sheriff Simmons to burst through at any moment. "You're safe here," Rebecca assured him, though she wasn't entirely convinced herself. Walter had a habit of checking the school during storms, ostensibly to ensure her safety, but more likely to remind her of his authority in town. "He'll find us," Mason said simply. "He always does." Rebecca didn't argue. Instead, she busied herself making a pallet of blankets and jackets near the stove where the children could sleep. Charlotte drifted off almost immediately, the combination of warmth, food, and exhaustion overwhelming her small body. Mason fought sleep longer, his thin shoulders squared with the weight of his self-appointed guardianship. "I'll keep watch," Rebecca promised. "Rest now, you've been brave long enough." She wasn't sure if he believed her, but his body eventually surrendered to fatigue. As the children slept, Rebecca paced the schoolroom, peering occasionally through frost-covered windows at the worsening blizzard. They were trapped at least until morning, maybe longer. The snow had already drifted halfway up the door. Her mind raced through options. She could take them to her cottage once the storm abated, but Walter would search there first. The church might offer sanctuary, but Pastor Green, while kind-hearted, was notoriously unable to keep secrets from his wife, who happened to be Walter's cousin. The Murphy farm might have taken them in, but they'd left last autumn after 3 failed harvests, their property now technically owned by the bank. The town of Pine Creek had never felt smaller or more confining. A sudden thump against the door startled her from her thoughts. Rebecca froze, listening. It came again, not the sound of knocking, but something heavy leaning against the wood. Her heart hammered as she approached, a fire poker clutched in white-knuckled fingers. "Who's there?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. No answer came, just another muffled thump followed by what sounded like a groan. Rebecca hesitated only briefly before unbolting the door. The wind immediately forced it wide, nearly knocking her backward as snow swirled into the room. Collapsed. On the threshold, half buried in a drift, was the unmistakable form of a man. Rebecca dropped the poker, grabbing his shoulders to drag him inside before forcing the door closed against the gale. The stranger lay face down, snow caked across his broad back and hat. For one terrifying moment, she thought it might be Walter. But this man was taller, his shoulders broader beneath the snow-covered coat. With effort, she rolled him onto his back, gasping when she saw his face. The right side was handsome in a weathered way, with a strong jaw and the beginnings of crow's feet around his closed eye. But the left side told a different story. A tapestry of scar tissue stretched from temple to jaw, pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent slight grimace. Rebecca recognized him immediately, though she'd only glimpsed him from afar on the rare occasions he came to town. Daniel Thompson, owner of the Whispering Pines ranch that sprawled across the hills northeast of town, the wealthy cattleman who'd become something of a local legend after pulling 6 men from a burning bunkhouse 5 years ago at the cost of his own unscarred face. She pressed her fingers to his neck, relieved to find a pulse. His skin was dangerously cold, but his breaths came steady. A shout from behind startled her. "Get away from him!" Mason stood beside the pallet, a piece of firewood clutched in his small hands like a weapon. "It's all right," Rebecca soothed, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "This man needs help, just like you did. He's nearly frozen." "That's the scarred rancher," Mason said, not lowering his makeshift club. "People say he's mean as a wounded bear." "People say a lot of things," Rebecca replied, already working to remove Daniel's snow-crusted coat. "Most of them born from fear of what they don't understand. Help me with his boots." Reluctantly, Mason set down the wood and approached. Together, they managed to remove Daniel's outer layers. Beneath the coat, his clothes were mostly dry, a testament to its quality. Rebecca propped his head on a folded jacket and covered him with the remaining blankets before adding more wood to the stove. "Is he gonna die?" Mason asked, studying the unconscious man with undisguised curiosity. "Not if I can help it," Rebecca answered, though uncertainty gnawed at her. Without proper medical supplies, she could only make him comfortable and hope his body was strong enough to recover from the cold. She needn't have worried. Within an hour, Daniel Thompson's eyes fluttered open, one a clear hazel, the other milky at the edges, where scar tissue encroached on the iris. He didn't startle or panic as many might upon waking in a strange place. Instead, he assessed the room with the calm calculation of a man accustomed to gauging his surroundings for threats. His gaze settled on Rebecca, who sat nearby grading papers to distract herself from the storm's howling. "The school teacher," he said, his voice a low rumble roughened by cold. It wasn't a question. "Rebecca Miller," she confirmed, setting down her pencil. "You collapsed outside the door. You're lucky I heard you." "Luck had little to do with it," he replied, struggling to sit up. "I saw the light, followed it when my horse threw me half a mile back." He glanced toward the children's pallet where both still slept soundly. "Yours?" "No," Rebecca said, suddenly protective. "They're—" She hesitated, unwilling to share their story with a stranger, regardless of his reputation. Daniel seemed to understand her reticence. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." He nodded once, then winced, his hand moving to his ribs. "Broke something in the fall, I think." "Let me see," Rebecca insisted, medical concerns overriding propriety. She helped him remove his shirt, revealing a torso mottled with bruises. Along the left side, where the scarring from the fire continued down his neck and across his shoulder. She probed gently, noting his controlled breathing when she touched particularly tender areas. 2 ribs cracked, possibly 3, she diagnosed. "You'll need to be still for a while. The storm has us trapped until it passes anyway." "I'm familiar with being trapped," he said, the unscarred corner of his mouth lifting slightly, though the company is usually less pleasant. Rebecca found herself returning the almost smile before she could think better of it. "I have some willow bark in my desk. It will help with the pain." As she prepared the medicinal tea, she felt his eyes following her movements. Not in the way Walter's used to, possessive and entitled, but with a quiet assessment that somehow didn't feel intrusive. "You're good at this," he observed as she handed him the steaming cup, "caring for others." "I'm a teacher," she replied simply. "It comes with the position. Some would have left us out there." he said, gesturing toward the children with his cup. "Storm like this, most think only of themselves." Rebecca wanted to protest that she wasn't special, that anyone would have done the same, but the words caught in her throat. She knew better. Pine Creek prided itself on community values, but those values had clear boundaries. Orphans were burdens, to be distributed where they could work for their keep. Reclusive, scarred ranchers were figures of suspicion rather than sympathy. "I couldn't leave them," she said instead, "any more than I could have left you." Daniel studied her face as if searching for something, then nodded once, apparently satisfied with what he found there. "Thompson," he said abruptly. "Daniel Thompson. I know who you are, Mr. Thompson." "Daniel," he corrected. "Titles have little meaning in weather like this." The howling wind punctuated his statement, rattling the schoolhouse windows with renewed fury. Rebecca added more wood to the stove, aware that their supply would need careful rationing if the storm continued much longer. "You're worried," Daniel observed, setting down his empty cup with a grimace of pain. "The wood won't last more than a day at this rate," she admitted, "and the food situation is equally concerning." Daniel reached for his coat, pulling something from an inner pocket. "I always carry provisions, habit from getting caught in storms before." He produced a package, wrapped in oilcloth, revealing strips of dried venison and a small sack of parched corn. "It's not much, but it'll help." Rebecca accepted the offering gratefully. "Thank you, A small voice interrupted her. "Miss Miller?" Charlotte had awakened, her thin face framed by tangled blonde hair as she peered from beneath the blankets. Her eyes widened at the sight of Daniel. "Who is that?" Before Rebecca could answer, Daniel spoke, his voice noticeably gentler than before. "Just a traveler caught in the storm, little one, like you." Charlotte studied him for a long moment, showing none of the fear or revulsion his scars typically evoked in children. Instead, she simply asked, "Does your face hurt?" Mason, now, awake and instantly protective, hissed, "Charlotte, you can't ask that." But Daniel only smiled, a real smile that transformed his face despite the scars. "Not anymore," he told her, "and you can ask me anything you like." Something in Rebecca's chest tightened at the exchange. She'd seen countless adults flinch, away from Daniel's appearance on the rare occasions he came to town for supplies. Yet this child, who had lost everything, showed only honest curiosity. Charlotte, apparently satisfied with his answer, emerged fully from the blankets and padded over to sit near the stove, dragging her blanket like a cloak. "I'm hungry," she announced. Rebecca divided the venison and corn, ensuring the children received the larger portions despite their protests. They ate in companionable silence, the storm their constant backdrop. When the meal was finished, Daniel surprised her by producing a small deck of playing cards from another pocket. "Ever played Old Maid?" he asked the children. Charlotte shook her head, but Mason nodded. "Pa taught me, but we didn't have cards." "Well then," Daniel said, shuffling with surprising dexterity, "consider this your first official lesson." The afternoon passed in a strange bubble of warmth and unexpected camaraderie. Rebecca found herself joining their games, laughing more than she had in months. Daniel proved to be patient with Charlotte's endless questions and respectful of Mason's lingering wariness. By evening, even Mason had relaxed enough to grin when Daniel deliberately played the wrong card, allowing the boy to win. As darkness fell outside, Charlotte drifted back to sleep, curled against her brother who soon followed. Rebecca and Daniel sat by the stove, speaking in low voices to avoid waking them. "What will happen to them?" Daniel asked, nodding toward the sleeping children. Rebecca sighed, the brief reprieve from worry evaporating. "Officially, the sheriff will place them with families in need of help. Separate families, most likely. In reality, they'll become unpaid laborers, working farms or shops in exchange for bare necessities. The sheriff seems to have considerable authority in these matters," Daniel observed, his tone carefully neutral. Walter Simmons takes considerable authority in all matters, Rebecca replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Especially those that allow him to exercise power over others. Daniel studied her face. You speak from experience. It wasn't a question, but Rebecca answered anyway. We were engaged, briefly, before I realized what kind of man hides behind that badge. Daniel nodded, requiring no further explanation. And now? Now he ensures I remember my place regularly, she said simply. A spinster schoolteacher should be grateful for her position, after all, particularly one who had the poor judgment to break an engagement to the town's most eligible bachelor. The sarcasm in her voice was unmistakable. Daniel's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. We have something in common then, he said. Neither of us meets Pine Creek's expectations. Rebecca looked at him, really looked, beyond the scars and the rumors. She saw intelligence in his eyes, kindness in how he treated the children, and a quiet dignity that had nothing to do with his considerable wealth. No, she agreed softly. I suppose we don't. They fell silent, listening to the gradually weakening wind. The worst of the storm had passed, though the snow would likely continue through the night. By morning, they would need to make decisions about the children's future, decisions that could put Rebecca at direct odds with Walter and the town council. I should check the perimeter, Daniel said abruptly, rising with a slight wince. Make sure the snow hasn't compromised the structure. Rebecca watched as he methodically examined each window and door, testing for drafts or signs of stress. His movements were precise despite his injuries, his attention to detail speaking of a man accustomed to self-reliance. When he returned to the stove, his expression had turned thoughtful. We'll be able to leave by mid-morning, he said. But the drifts are significant. The children won't manage the walk to town. They can come to my cottage, Rebecca said immediately. At least until the sheriff finds them, Daniel finished for her. How long do you think that will take? A day, 2 at most. She twisted her hands in her lap. Walter makes a point of checking on me after storms. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Out of concern, naturally. Naturally, she echoed hollowly. He was silent for a long moment, staring into the glowing stove as if searching for something in the flames. When he spoke again, his voice had a deliberate quality, as if each word had been carefully considered. My ranch has room, he said. Plenty of it. The children would be safe there, beyond the sheriff's immediate reach. Rebecca's heart leapt before caution tempered her hope. Walter's jurisdiction covers the entire county, officially. Officially, Daniel agreed. But Whispering Pines has certain advantages: remote location, loyal hands who value privacy, natural barriers that make uninvited visits challenging at best. You would do that? Take in 2 orphans you've only just met? Daniel's expression softened as he glanced at the sleeping children. I know what it's like to be judged by circumstances beyond your control, to be seen as less than human because of something you didn't choose. His hand unconsciously rose to the scarred side of his face before dropping back to his lap. No child deserves that fate. Rebecca felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something dangerously like hope. Walter won't stop looking. He doesn't like to lose. Neither do I, Daniel said simply. They stayed awake long into the night, speaking in low voices, making plans. Daniel knew the land better than anyone in Pine Creek, having mapped every stream and ravine of his extensive property. He described a route that would bypass the main roads, following game trails and creek beds to avoid leaving obvious tracks. What about you? He asked as the night deepened. The sheriff will question you about the children. Let him, Rebecca said with more confidence than she felt. I'll say they left while I slept. That I assumed they'd gone into town seeking help. Daniel shook his head. Walter Simmons doesn't strike me as a man who accepts convenient explanations. No, she agreed, but he can't prove otherwise. He can make your life difficult, Daniel pointed out, more difficult than it already is. Rebecca squared her shoulders. I'm rather accustomed to difficulty, Mr. Thompson. The corner of his mouth lifted. I believe we established it's Daniel. Morning brought weak sunshine and a world transformed. Snow blanketed everything, smoothing the rough edges of reality beneath pristine white. The children woke excited by the brightness, pressing their faces to the windows to marvel at drifts taller than Mason. Rebecca prepared a meager breakfast from their remaining provisions, while Daniel checked outside, clearing a path from the door and assessing the condition of the surrounding area. When he returned, his expression was determined. We should leave within the hour, he announced. The main road to town is already showing signs of activity. It won't be long before someone makes their way here to check on you. Charlotte looked up from her breakfast, anxiety clouding her features. Are we going to the sheriff now? No, little one, Rebecca assured her, kneeling to meet her eyes. You and Mason are going somewhere safe. With him? Mason asked, nodding toward Daniel with mingled hope and suspicion. Daniel didn't attempt to persuade the boy with false promises. My ranch is remote, secure. The sheriff rarely ventures. There, you'll have food, shelter, and no one will separate you from your sister. Mason's eyes narrowed. What do you want in return? Mason, Rebecca admonished, but Daniel raised a hand to stop her. It's a fair question, he said, addressing the boy directly. I want nothing from you except that you keep your sister safe, help with age-appropriate chores as you're able, and consider Whispering Pines your home for as long as you need it. Rebecca felt her throat tighten at the sincerity in his voice. This was not charity offered from obligation, but genuine sanctuary extended from understanding. Mason studied Daniel's face with the intensity only children can manage, searching for deception and finding none. Finally, he nodded once. I can do that. The next half hour passed in a flurry of preparation. Rebecca gathered what supplies. She could spare extra blankets, a few books for the children, dried apples from her desk that she'd forgotten until now. Daniel fashioned a crude sled from a wooden bench, tying it with rope he'd had in his coat. Charlotte can ride, he explained. Mason and I will pull. The snow's too deep for the little one to walk all that way. When everything was ready, Rebecca knelt before the children, straightening Charlotte's too large borrowed scarf and adjusting Mason's cap. Be brave, she told them. Listen to Mr. Thompson. He'll keep you safe until... She faltered, unsure how to finish the sentence. Until you come, Charlotte said with complete certainty, throwing thin arms around Rebecca's neck. Rebecca returned the embrace, meeting Daniel's eyes over the child's shoulder. His expression held a question she wasn't ready to answer. Instead, she hugged Mason, who endured it stiffly for a moment before returning the gesture with surprising fierceness. Take care of them, she told Daniel as they prepared to depart. You have my word, he replied, his voice carrying a weight that told her exactly how seriously he took such promises. She watched them leave, Daniel breaking trail through the snow with powerful strides, Mason following in his footsteps while helping to pull the makeshift sled carrying Charlotte. They headed northeast, away from town, toward the distant hills where Whispering Pines Ranch lay hidden in a sheltered valley. Rebecca remained at the schoolhouse, straightening evidence of their presence and rehearsing the story she would tell. Walter, when he inevitably arrived, she didn't have to wait long. By mid-afternoon, the distinctive sound of horses approaching announced visitors. Rebecca steeled herself, arranging her features into an expression of relief as Walter Simmons pushed through the door, followed by two deputies. "Rebecca!" he exclaimed with a show of concern that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. "We've been worried sick. Half the town snowed in, and here you are all alone." "Not entirely alone," she said, sticking to the plan. "I had unexpected guests. During the height of the storm, 2 children, orphans from the wagon accident at White Pine Crossing." Walter's expression darkened. "The white children. They were here." "They sought shelter from the storm," Rebecca explained. "I couldn't turn them away. But they left this morning, heading toward town. I assumed they'd been found." "No children have arrived in town," Walter said slowly, suspicion creeping into his voice. "You're certain they left?" "I woke and they were gone," Rebecca said, the half-truth easier to tell than she'd expected. "I would have followed, but with the school to secure." Walter's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the room, noting the disturbed blankets, the depleted firewood, the playing cards still stacked on a desk. "Mighty comfortable setup for a single night's shelter," he observed. "The storm lasted 2 days, Walter," she reminded him. "What would you have had me do? Send children back into a blizzard?" He didn't answer directly, moving instead to examine the floor near the door. "Interesting tracks here," he said casually. "Larger than a child's. A man's boot, I'd say." Rebecca felt cold dread pool in her stomach, but kept her expression neutral. A traveler caught in the storm, like the children. He left at first light as well. "Did this traveler have a name?" Walter asked, straightening to his full height, using his position to loom over her, as he'd done countless times before. "He didn't offer one," Rebecca lied, forcing herself to meet his gaze steadily. Walter studied her face, clearly searching for signs of deception. Whatever he saw there caused his jaw to tighten. "Those children are wards of the county now," he said. "Harboring them without official placement is against the law." "I didn't harbor them, Walter. I provided emergency shelter during a life-threatening storm, as any decent person would." The implied criticism wasn't lost on him. His eyes hardened. "Those children need to be placed with proper families, separate homes that can provide for their individual needs. Like the Anderson farm, where boys magically never attend school because they're needed in the fields," Rebecca challenged, anger overriding caution. "Or the miller's textile shop, where little girls work 14 hours a day?" Walter's face flushed. "You're overstepping, Rebecca. Again, this is official county business, not a schoolmom's concern." Rebecca straightened her spine. "Children's welfare is every teacher's concern." For a moment she thought he might strike her. His hand twitched at his side, and the deputies exchanged uncomfortable glances. Instead, he smiled thinly. "We'll find them," he promised. "And when we do, I'll remember who assisted in their disappearance." After Walter and his deputies departed, Rebecca sat heavily at her desk, trembling with delayed reaction. She had bought the children time, but at what cost? Walter would search for them relentlessly now, if only to prove his authority. And when he failed to find them, if he failed, his retribution would fall squarely on her shoulders. Her position as teacher, her home, her very place in the community, all now balanced on a knife's edge. For 2 orphaned children she barely knew, and a scarred rancher who had offered them sanctuary. Yet strangely, as she gathered her belongings to finally return to her cottage, Rebecca felt lighter than she had in years. Whatever came next, she had chosen something other than quiet acquiescence to Walter's vision of justice. She had chosen courage. Outside, fresh snow began to fall again, gradually filling in the tracks leading northeast toward Whispering Pines Ranch, toward Daniel Thompson and the children who now depended on him. Toward a future Rebecca couldn't yet imagine, but suddenly, desperately wanted to see. Rebecca awakened the next morning to sunlight streaming through the schoolhouse windows. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind before memories of the previous day rushed back. The children, the storm, Daniel Thompson. She sat up quickly, scanning the room. Mason and Charlotte still slept peacefully near the stove, which had burned down to embers during the night. but Daniel was already awake, standing at the window with his back to her, gazing out at the transformed landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of pristine white. Sunlight glinted off snow-laden tree branches, creating a scene of almost painful beauty. The kind of beauty that masked deadly cold beneath its sparkling surface. "The main road's been partially cleared," Daniel said without turning. "Someone drove a wagon through not long ago." Rebecca pushed aside her blanket and joined him at the window. Sure enough, the distant road showed tracks cutting through the deep snow. "Walter," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. "He'll be checking on outlying properties." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful as he turned to face her. In the morning light, his scars seemed less severe, or perhaps she was simply becoming accustomed to them. "We should move quickly then, before he decides to extend his goodwill to the schoolteacher." There was a dry humor in his voice that surprised a small smile from Rebecca. "His goodwill generally comes with conditions." "I suspected as much," Daniel replied. "I've prepared some provisions for our journey." He gestured toward a small pack he'd assembled from items in the schoolroom, a tin cup filled with melted snow water, the remaining dried meat wrapped in cloth, even a small first aid kit Rebecca kept in her desk. "You've been busy," she observed. "Don't sleep much," he said simply, offering no further explanation, though the shadows beneath his eyes told their own story. The children stirred then, Charlotte blinking up at them with sleep-tousled hair, while Mason immediately sat up, alert and watchful. Rebecca moved to them, kneeling to check Charlotte's temperature with the back of her hand. The dangerous chill of the previous night had receded. Her skin felt normal, if a bit dry. "Good morning," Rebecca said gently. "How are you feeling?" "Hungry," Charlotte answered frankly, drawing a surprised laugh from Daniel. "Direct and honest," he commented. "Admirable qualities." Mason watched this exchange with cautious eyes, his gaze darting between the adults. "Are we leaving now?" he asked, getting straight to the point in a manner that suggested he was accustomed to sudden departures. Rebecca nodded. "Yes, but first, we'll have something to eat. Then Mr. Thompson has offered you and Charlotte a place to stay at his ranch." "Where the sheriff won't find us," Mason pressed, his young face serious. "That's the hope," Daniel confirmed, matching the boy's gravity. "But I won't lie to you. He may still search there eventually." Rebecca appreciated his honesty with the children. Too many adults made promises they couldn't keep, especially to those they deemed too young to handle difficult truths. They ate a sparse breakfast of the remaining food, everyone conscious of the need to conserve what little they had for the journey ahead. As they finished, Rebecca gathered what supplies she could reasonably contribute without raising suspicion later, when Walter inevitably questioned her. "You should wear these," she told Charlotte, pulling a pair of woolen mittens from her desk. "Or draw. And this." She wrapped her own scarf around the girl's thin neck, tucking it securely. Daniel observed this with an expression Rebecca couldn't quite decipher. "You've given them your warmest things," he noted. "What will you use when we're gone?" "I'll manage," she said, avoiding his gaze. "I always do." The unspoken question hung between them. Was she coming with them to the ranch, or staying behind to face Walter's interrogation? Rebecca herself wasn't certain of the answer until Daniel spoke again. "You know," he said carefully, "there's another option." Rebecca looked up, meeting his steady gaze. "Come with us," he said simply, "to Whispering Pines." Mason's head snapped up, eyes widening. Charlotte actually clapped her small hands together. "Yes, Miss Miller." The little girl exclaimed, "Please come with us!" Rebecca's heart contracted painfully. The offer was tempting. More tempting than she wanted to admit, but reality intruded on the momentary fantasy. "And when Walter comes looking, when he finds all three of us missing," she asked. "He's not a man who forgives being outmaneuvered." "Let me worry about the sheriff," Daniel replied, his voice taking on a harder edge that reminded her he was more than just the gentleman who'd played cards with the children. He was also the rancher who'd built an empire from nothing, who commanded respect, even from those who feared his scarred appearance. "If I disappear with you, he'll never stop searching," Rebecca insisted. "But if I stay, create a false trail suggesting the children headed into town. I can buy you time to establish them at Whispering Pines, perhaps even arrange more permanent solutions." Daniel studied her face, clearly torn between admiration for her practicality and concern for her safety. "He'll be angry when he discovers the deception." "Walter's always angry about something," Rebecca said with forced lightness. "One more transgression won't make much difference." The lie felt hollow, even as she spoke it. They both knew Walter. Simmons would view this as far more than a minor transgression. This was outright defiance, a direct challenge to his authority. The retribution would be swift and severe. "I can handle Walter," Rebecca added more confidently than she felt. "I've been doing it for years." Daniel didn't look convinced, but he respected her decision with a solemn nod. "We should leave within the hour. The snow's deep, but passable if we stick to the game trails along the ridgeline." Rebecca helped the children prepare, ensuring Charlotte's borrowed boots were stuffed with extra fabric to keep them from slipping off her smaller feet, showing Mason how to wrap the blanket as an extra layer beneath his coat. All the while, she was acutely aware of Daniel's presence as he moved about the schoolroom, his quiet efficiency somehow reassuring. When everything was ready, they stood by the door, the moment of departure suddenly awkward. Rebecca knelt to embrace the children, her throat tight with emotion she couldn't afford to show. "Be brave," she told them, straightening Charlotte's bonnet. "Listen to Mr. Thompson. He'll keep you safe." "When will you come visit us?" Charlotte asked, her small face serious. Rebecca hesitated, unwilling to make promises she might not be able to keep. "As soon as I can," she finally said, the words tasting bittersweet. Mason, perceptive beyond his years, gave her a long look. "You're staying to protect us," he said, not a question, but a statement of fact. "Like Pa did at the river." Rebecca's eyes burned. "Your father was very brave," she managed. "So are you," the boy replied simply, and then surprised her by wrapping his arms fiercely around her neck in a brief, tight embrace before stepping back, embarrassed by his own display of emotion. Daniel had watched this exchange silently. Now, he stepped forward, his expression grave. "I want your word that you'll send for help if Simmons becomes problematic." "I can handle," Rebecca began. "Your word," Daniel interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Pride has no place in safety." Rebecca recognized the wisdom in his statement, even as it chafed against her independent nature. "Very well, you have my word." He nodded, apparently satisfied. Then, to her surprise, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small revolver. "Take this." "Daniel, I can't." "You can and you will," he insisted, pressing the weapon into her hand. "It's loaded. The safety is here." He demonstrated, briefly. "I don't expect you'll need it, but knowing you have it will help me sleep tonight." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, a momentary contact that seemed to linger on Rebecca's skin. She tucked the revolver into her pocket, oddly comforted by its weight despite her reservations. "We'll take the North Trail," Daniel explained, pointing through the window toward a line of pines that marked the beginning of the ridge. "It's longer, but less likely to be watched. When the sheriff comes, tell him you saw the children heading east toward town." Rebecca nodded, memorizing the details. "And if he asks about you, tell him you never saw me," Daniel said. "A traveler caught in the storm who left before dawn. No name, no destination shared." It was a story with enough truth to be believable, yet vague enough to provide no useful information. Rebecca wondered how many times Daniel had needed to obscure his movements in the past, and why. "One last thing," Daniel said, his voice dropping lower. He withdrew a small folded paper from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. "My foreman's name is Jim Holloway. If you need help, any kind of help, show him this. He'll bring you to Whispering Pines immediately." Rebecca glanced at the paper, finding a rough sketch of a pine tree with initials carved into the trunk. "A token?" "Of sorts," Daniel confirmed. "Jim knows to trust anyone bearing that symbol." The care with which he'd thought through these contingencies both reassured and alarmed Rebecca. Daniel Thompson clearly lived his life prepared for emergencies, for situations where quick escapes and secret signals might mean the difference between safety and danger. "Thank you," she said softly, tucking the paper into her dress pocket alongside the revolver. "For everything." Daniel held her gaze a moment longer than necessary. "We'll wait for you," he said quietly, "however long it takes." Then, with a nod that conveyed more than words could have, he turned and opened the door. Cold air rushed in as he ushered the children out into the blinding white world, Mason holding Charlotte's hand tightly. Rebecca stood in the doorway watching as they made their way toward the tree line, Daniel breaking trail through snow that reached past his knees in places. At the edge of the forest, he turned back once, raising his hand in a gesture that might have been farewell or promise. Rebecca returned it, hoping he could see the silent pledge in her stance. She would protect their secret, whatever the cost. Then they were gone, swallowed by the shadows beneath the pines, leaving Rebecca alone in the doorway with nothing but footprints in the snow to prove they had ever been there. She closed the door against the cold and leaned her forehead against the rough wood, allowing herself one brief moment of doubt before straightening her shoulders. There was work to be done. Walter would arrive soon, and she needed to be ready. Rebecca spent the next hour erasing evidence of Daniel's presence while carefully preserving signs of the children's stay. She rumpled the blankets where they had slept, left one of Charlotte's mittens accidentally beneath the desk, made sure the playing cards remained visible on the table. When she finished, the schoolroom told exactly the story she wanted Walter to read. That of a teacher who had sheltered 2 orphaned children during the storm, only to have them continue their journey toward town when morning came. She was sweeping the floor when she heard the crunch of horse hooves on packed snow. Taking a deep breath, Rebecca smoothed her skirt and pinched color into her pale cheeks. Then she moved to the window, peering out as Walter Simmons dismounted from his gelding, accompanied by 2 deputies on horseback. He cut an imposing figure. In his heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat, confidence evident in every movement, handsome in a conventional way, with his blonde hair and blue eyes, Walter had been considered quite a catch when he'd proposed to Rebecca 3 years earlier. Only after their engagement had she glimpsed the cruelty beneath the charming facade. The casual way he spoke of managing the town's less fortunate, his disdain for those he deemed inferior, the cold anger when contradicted. By the time she'd broken the engagement, half the town had already aligned themselves with their popular sheriff. The other half were too afraid to openly support her. Rebecca had kept her teaching position only because no one else wanted the meager salary and isolated location the schoolhouse offered. The door swung open without a knock. Walter's presumption of welcome as familiar as it was unwelcome. Cold air swirled around his tall frame as he stepped inside, removing his hat with a practiced gesture of courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. "Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying that peculiar mixture of concern and condescension she'd come to know so well. "We've been worried about you out here all alone in this terrible storm." "Walter," she acknowledged with a nod. "I'm perfectly fine, as you can see." He glanced around the schoolroom, taking in the disturbed blankets, the remnants of the fire, the small signs she'd carefully arranged. His gaze was methodical, missing nothing. The deputies remained by the door, silent sentinels. "Not entirely alone, I see," Walter observed, picking up the deck of cards with a raised eyebrow. "Entertaining during the blizzard?" Rebecca forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "I had unexpected company. 2 children from that wagon accident at White Pine Crossing. They sought shelter here during the worst of the storm." Walter's expression sharpened. "The White children? Mason and Charlotte?" "They didn't give surnames," Rebecca said, the first deliberate lie slipping from her lips with surprising ease. "But yes, a boy around 10 and his younger sister. They were half frozen when I found them in the old Murphy barn." "Where are they now?" Walter demanded, the pretense of casual conversation dropping away. "Gone," Rebecca replied simply. "They left at first light, heading toward town. I assumed they'd reached you hours ago." Walter's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "No children. They've arrived in town today." Rebecca allowed her eyes to widen with what she hoped was convincing concern. "That's strange. They were quite determined. The boy seemed to think relatives might be waiting for them there." "Relatives?" Walter repeated skeptically. "The Whites were new to the territory. No connections here that I'm aware of." "Perhaps I misunderstood," Rebecca suggested. "The children were exhausted and frightened. The little girl barely spoke at all." Walter moved further into the room, his gaze falling on the small mitten Rebecca had deliberately left behind. He picked it up, turning it over in his large hands. "Seems a shame they'd leave without proper protection from the cold, almost as if they left in a hurry." Rebecca tensed, but kept her expression neutral. "They were eager to reach town before another storm might hit. I offered to accompany them, but the boy insisted they knew the way." Walter hummed non-committally, continuing his circuit of the schoolroom. When he reached the window overlooking the northern forest, he paused, studying the distant tree line with narrowed eyes. "Interesting tracks leading that direction," he observed casually, "not heading toward town at all." Rebecca's heart stuttered, but she'd prepared for this. "Some of my students came by yesterday morning to check on me before the storm worsened. The Pembroke children from the sawmill. They live north of here." The lie came smoothly, calculated to be difficult for Walter to immediately verify. The Pembrokes did indeed have children who attended her school, and their home lay several miles north. By the time Walter could question them, the tracks would be obscured by new snowfall or wind. Walter turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "Always so many people concerned with your welfare, Rebecca. The Pembroke children, the white orphans. You seem to inspire unusual loyalty." There was something dangerous in his tone, a current of anger beneath the bland observation. Rebecca recognized it as jealousy, an emotion that had surfaced frequently during their brief engagement whenever other men had shown her attention. "I'm a teacher, Walter," she replied calmly. "Children tend to form attachments." He moved closer, invading her space in the way he knew she disliked. "And what about adults? Do they form attachments too?" Rebecca held her ground, though every instinct urged her to step back. "I don't know what you mean." Walter reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face in a gesture that might have seemed tender if not for the coldness in his eyes. Not while she could still maintain the facade of ignorance, still divert Walter's attention from Daniel's ranch. She would hold her position as long as possible, protecting the children from afar the only way she knew how. Rebecca gathered her things with renewed determination. She would return to her cottage, prepare for school the following day, as if nothing unusual had occurred, and wait. For Walter's next move, for news of the children, for the moment when pretense became impossible. And when that moment came, she touched the revolver again. She would be ready. The journey to her cottage passed in a blur of tension, every distant sound triggering a surge of adrenaline. But Rebecca encountered no one on the snow-covered path, the town still largely homebound after the blizzard's fury. Her cottage, when She reached it, stood silent and cold, exactly as she had left it 2 days earlier. She lit the stove with trembling hands, the familiar routine of building a fire serving to calm her frayed nerves. As warmth gradually filled the small space, Rebecca sank into her chair by the window, exhaustion washing over her in waves. She hadn't truly slept in days, kept awake by the storm, the children's needs, and Daniel's unexpected presence. Daniel. His scarred face appeared in her mind's eye, not frightening as many found it, but compelling in its asymmetry. One side, handsome and whole, the other marked by sacrifice. Like the man himself, part gentle protector, part hardened survivor, Rebecca hadn't expected to feel this connection to him, this sense of shared purpose that transcended their brief acquaintance. Perhaps it was merely the intensity of their circumstances, the heightened emotions of danger and rescue, or perhaps it was something more fundamental, a recognition of kindred spirits who had both chosen difficult paths rather than easy conformity. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Rebecca froze, her hand automatically moving to the revolver in her pocket. Walter wouldn't knock, he'd simply enter with his usual presumption of welcome. One of his deputies, perhaps, or a concerned neighbor. "Who is it?" she called, proud of the steadiness in her voice, despite her pounding heart. "Margaret Wilson, dear. Just checking that you've made it home safely after that dreadful storm." Relief flooded through Rebecca as she recognized the voice of her elderly neighbor, the widow who lived in the small house adjacent to her own. She tucked the revolver deeper into her pocket before opening the door. Margaret stood on the step, her wrinkled face peering from beneath a woolen shawl dusted with snowflakes. In her gloved hands, she held a covered basket that emitted a tantalizing aroma of fresh bread. "I thought you might need some sustenance," Margaret explained, extending the basket. "Being trapped at that schoolhouse with nothing but those awful preserved biscuits you keep in your desk." Rebecca accepted the offering with genuine gratitude. "How did you know I was at the school?" "Where else would you be?" Margaret replied practically, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You're too conscientious to leave early when a storm's brewing, and too sensible to attempt the walk home once it arrived." She paused, studying Rebecca's face with shrewd eyes. "Though you appear to have had quite an adventure nonetheless." And Dorit, there was something in the old woman's tone that gave Rebecca pause. Margaret had lived in Pine Creek longer than most, had watched the town change through decades of progress and setbacks. Very little escaped her notice, and she held no particular love for Walter Simmons, having clashed with him repeatedly over her refusal to sell her small property to his associates for development. "It was an eventful night," Rebecca admitted carefully. "The storm was worse than expected." Margaret hummed non-committally, settling herself in a chair by the stove with the ease of long familiarity. "I saw the sheriff ride by not an hour ago, headed east with those 2 lackeys he calls deputies. Looking quite determined, I might add. It wasn't a question, but the invitation for explanation hung in the air between them." Rebecca hesitated, weighing her words carefully. Margaret Wilson was no gossip, but neither was she involved in the situation with the white children. The less she knew, the safer she would be if Walter's interrogations expanded to include Rebecca's neighbors. "Walter checks on outlying properties after storms," Rebecca said, the bland explanation containing just enough truth to sound plausible. "Official duties." Margaret's snort made her opinion of Walter's official duties abundantly clear. "The same duties that had him searching the Murphy barn this morning, or questioning Elias Pembroke about when his children last visited the schoolhouse." Rebecca's blood ran cold. "He's been to the Pembrokes already. Stopped there directly after leaving you, I'd wager," Margaret confirmed, her sharp eyes missing nothing of Rebecca's reaction. "Elias mentioned it when he came to borrow my snow shovel," said the sheriff seemed particularly interested in tracks leading north from the schoolhouse. The falsehood about the Pembroke children checking on her before the storm had unraveled faster than Rebecca anticipated. Walter was moving with unexpected efficiency, methodically dismantling her carefully constructed narrative. "I see," Rebecca said, attempting to mask her concern. "Walter has always been thorough." "Thorough indeed," Margaret agreed dryly. "Especially when his pride is at stake." She leaned forward, lowering her voice despite the empty cottage. "I also heard tell that those poor white children survived the river accident, that they might be in need of proper placement." The emphasis she placed on proper placement left no doubt of her feelings on Walter's methods. Rebecca remained silent, unwilling to confirm or deny anything that might later prove dangerous for the elderly widow. Margaret sighed at her reticence. "My dear, I have lived in this town for 73 years. I've seen powerful men come and go. I've watched good people make difficult choices." She reached across to pat Rebecca's hand with gnarled fingers. "Whatever you've done, I suspect it was the right thing." "Thank you." Once inside, with the door firmly closed, Margaret's facade dropped immediately. "Sheriff's called a town meeting for tomorrow evening," she said without preamble. "Mandatory attendance for all residents, something about community safety and civic responsibility." Rebecca sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. "Has he found the children?" "Not that I've heard," Margaret replied, pouring tea with hands that betrayed a slight tremor. "But there's talk, rumors that someone helped them escape, that perhaps they never intended to reach town at all." The specificity of the rumors confirmed Rebecca's fears. Someone had been piecing together evidence, drawing conclusions that pointed increasingly in her direction. But how much did they actually know? And what did Walter intend to do about it at tomorrow's meeting? "There's more," Margaret continued, her voice dropping lower. "Elias Pembroke was brought in for questioning this morning. Something about contradicting statements regarding his children's whereabouts before the storm." Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. The false alibi she'd constructed involving the Pembroke children had now entangled an innocent family in her deception. Guilt coiled in her stomach. "He was released an hour later," Margaret added, looking shaken but unharmed. "His wife was telling anyone who would listen that the sheriff accused them of conspiracy." Conspiracy. The word hung in the air between them, its legal implications clear. Walter was no longer treating the children's disappearance as a simple case of runaways. He was building a case against those he believed had assisted them, with Rebecca clearly at the center of his suspicions. "I should leave," Rebecca said quietly, "tonight, before the meeting." Margaret studied her with shrewd eyes. "And go where, child? The sheriff has men watching the roads. The stagecoach isn't due for 3 days, and the next train doesn't arrive until Friday." The elderly woman was right, of course. Pine Creek might be small, but it was effectively isolated, especially with Walter's deputies patrolling the main routes in and out of town. Rebecca's options for escape were limited at best. "Besides," Margaret continued, "running now would only confirm whatever suspicions he's harboring. Better to face him directly, deny everything convincingly, and weather the storm." Rebecca wasn't so certain. Walter's determination had taken on an almost obsessive quality that went beyond professional duty. There was something personal in his pursuit, a vendetta fueled by wounded pride and thwarted authority. "What if I can't weather it?" Rebecca asked, voicing her deepest fear. "What if he has proof?" "Proof of what, exactly?" Margaret challenged. "That you sheltered children during a blizzard? That's simple human decency, not a crime. As for anything else..." She shrugged expressively. "Hearsay and conjecture aren't evidence, my dear, not in any court worth its salt." Rebecca wasn't convinced that legal standards would matter much. In a town where Walter Simmons' word was effectively law, but she appreciated Margaret's attempt at reassurance. They finished their tea in thoughtful silence, Rebecca's mind racing through scenarios and contingencies. "Whatever you decide," Margaret said as Rebecca prepared to leave. "Remember, my back door is always open, and I keep a loaded shotgun beneath my bed. Have since my Herbert passed 30 years ago, just in case you need more persuasive arguments than words." The offer, made with the same matter-of-fact tone Margaret might use to recommend a baking technique, startled a surprised laugh from Rebecca. She impulsively hugged the older woman, drawing comfort from her sturdy presence. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." "Don't thank me yet," Margaret replied. "Wait until we've both survived tomorrow's meeting. Now go home and rest. You look like you haven't slept properly in days." Rebecca couldn't argue with that assessment. Sleep had indeed been elusive, her nights filled with restless worry and planning. Nevertheless, she dutifully returned to her cottage, secured the doors and windows, and attempted to rest before preparing for the following day's classes. She had just settled into her chair with a stack of student compositions when a soft tapping sound drew her attention to the window. Rebecca froze, listening intently. It came again, 3 quick taps followed by 2 slower ones, deliberate, rhythmic, not the random sound of a branch against glass. Moving cautiously to the window, she peered into the gathering darkness. Nothing moved in her small yard. No shadows betrayed the presence of a visitor. She was about to dismiss the sound as imagination when movement caught her eye. A figure slipping between the trees at the edge of her property, visible for only a moment before disappearing again. Rebecca's hand moved to her pocket, where Daniel's revolver remained a constant companion. Should she ignore the signal, pretend she hadn't heard or seen anything? The prudent course, certainly, with Walter's scrutiny intensifying. But something in the deliberate pattern of the taps, the cautious movement of the figure, suggested this was not one of the sheriff's men. Making a swift decision, Rebecca extinguished her lamp, waited for her eyes to adjust to the darkness, then moved silently to her back door. She eased it open, wincing at the slight creak of the hinges, and stepped onto the small porch, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "Miss Miller." The whisper came from her left, near the apple tree that marked the boundary between her property and Margaret's. A man's voice, low and unfamiliar. "Who's there?" she called softly, the revolver now in her hand, though still concealed within the folds of her skirt. The figure stepped partially from the shadows, a tall man in a battered hat pulled low over his face. "Jim Holloway," he said, keeping his voice barely audible, "from Whispering Pines. Daniel's foreman, the man who would recognize the pine tree symbol." Rebecca's pulse quickened. "Why are you here?" she asked, not moving closer, her hand still firmly on the concealed weapon. "Mr. Thompson sent me," Holloway replied. "Said to tell you the package arrived safely. No damage in transit." The children were safe. Relief flooded through Rebecca, momentarily weakening her knees. "He didn't need to risk sending a messenger," she said once she'd composed herself. "I trusted him to keep them safe." "There's more," Holloway continued, still maintaining his careful distance. "He wants you to know the sheriff paid a visit to the ranch yesterday. Asked a lot of questions about Mr. Thompson's whereabouts during the storm." Cold fear replaced Rebecca's momentary relief. "Did he find anything?" "No, ma'am. The boss made sure of that. The children are well hidden, and all the hands gave the same story, that Mr. Thompson was at the ranch the entire time, confined to his quarters with a bad case of influenza." The coordination of this cover story impressed Rebecca, even as it worried her. Daniel had anticipated Walter's suspicions with remarkable accuracy. "The boss also said to tell you that the offer still stands," Holloway added. "If things get difficult here, said you'd understand what that means." Rebecca nodded slowly. The offer to join them at Whispering Pines, a sanctuary beyond Walter's immediate reach. It was tempting, more tempting with each passing hour, as the sheriff's net seemed to tighten around her. "Tell him I'm grateful," she said finally, But I can't leave yet, not with the scrutiny I'm under. Any attempt to flee would only confirm suspicions and potentially lead Walter straight to the ranch. Holloway studied her for a moment, his features indistinct in the darkness. Boss said you might say that. Told me to give you this if you insisted on staying. He extended his hand, offering a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Rebecca accepted it cautiously, feeling the weight and shape of what appeared to be a folded document of some kind. "What is it?" she asked. "Don't know, ma'am. Boss said it was for your eyes only." Holloway tipped his hat slightly. "I should go. Already risked too much coming into town with the sheriff's men watching the roads." "How did you get past them?" Rebecca couldn't help asking. A ghost of a smile crossed what she could see of the man's face. "There are ways in and out of Pine Creek that don't involve roads, Miss Miller. Ways that only those who truly know this land remember." He nodded toward the package in her hands. "Boss says to use that only if absolutely necessary. Said you'd know when the time was right." With that cryptic statement, he melted back into the shadows, leaving Rebecca standing alone on her porch, the mysterious package clutched in her hands, and new questions swirling in her mind. Back inside, with the doors securely locked and curtains drawn, Rebecca carefully unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside lay a folded document bearing an official seal she recognized as belonging to the territorial court. Attached to it was a brief note. In a bold, masculine hand, "Rebecca, this may provide leverage if Simmons becomes too aggressive. Use with caution. The bearer can be trusted implicitly if you need swift passage to Whispering Pines. Stay safe." D. The document itself appeared to be a legal affidavit, sworn and notarized by a judge in Helena City. As Rebecca scanned its contents, her eyes widened in shocked understanding. Here, in carefully documented legal language, was evidence of corruption involving Walter Simmons and several prominent businessmen in Pine Creek. Detailed accounts of bribes accepted, laws selectively enforced, and most damning of all, proof that Walter had deliberately falsified records regarding orphaned children to ensure their placement with associates who provided kickbacks for the free labor. This was dynamite, the kind of evidence that could not only destroy Walter's career, but potentially send him to prison. How Daniel had obtained such information, Rebecca couldn't begin to guess, though it suggested connections and resources far beyond what she had imagined he possessed. It also represented a double-edged sword. Using this information against Walter would undoubtedly protect her and the children in the short term, but it would also reveal Daniel's hand in the matter, potentially exposing his involvement in the children's disappearance. He had trusted her with a weapon that could harm him as much as it protected her. Rebecca carefully refolded the document and concealed it beneath a loose floorboard under her bed, a hiding place she had used for years to store her most private correspondence and journals. Then she sat at her small writing desk, mind racing, with new possibilities and dangers. The town meeting tomorrow now presented both greater risk and opportunity. Walter clearly intended to use it as a forum to pressure her, perhaps even to publicly accuse her of conspiracy. But armed with this new information, she had options beyond simple denial or flight. The question was whether she dared use them, and at what cost to Daniel and his reputation. The fact that he had given her this choice spoke volumes about his trust in her judgment, or perhaps his desperation to ensure her safety, regardless of consequences to himself. Sleep eluded Rebecca entirely that night. She sat by her window until dawn broke over the eastern hills, watching for any sign of Walter's men patrolling the streets, rehearsing what she would say at the meeting, turning over scenarios in her mind like stones in a riverbed, searching for the smoothest path forward. Morning brought no clarity, only the grim determination to face whatever came with as much courage as she could muster. Rebecca dressed with particular care, selecting her most formal teaching attire, a high-necked navy dress with modest white collar that conveyed both authority and propriety. She pinned her hair in a severe style that added years to her appearance, a deliberate choice to emphasize her position as the town's respected educator rather than a woman alone. The day passed in a blur of routine activities performed by rote. Her students seemed to sense her distraction, behaving with unusual decorum that under other circumstances might have pleased her. Today, their quiet compliance only underscored the abnormality of the situation. At precisely 3 o'clock, Rebecca dismissed her class, watching them scatter toward their homes with a strange hollowness in her chest. How many more times would she stand in this doorway, sending children back to their families? If Walter had his way, would this be her final day as Pine Creek's teacher? She was straightening the classroom, delaying her return to town, when a sharp knock sounded at the door. Rebecca tensed, her hand automatically moving toward her pocket before she composed herself and called, "Come in!" The door swung open to reveal Alice Pembroke, Elias's wife and mother to 3 of Rebecca's students. A thin, careworn woman with permanently chapped hands from washing other people's laundry, Alice rarely visited the school, sending her husband for parent meetings or her oldest daughter for messages. "Mrs. Pembroke," Rebecca greeted her, hiding her surprise. "What can I do for you?" Alice closed the door carefully behind her, glancing nervously over her shoulder as if expecting to be observed. "Miss Miller," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I needed to speak with you about what Elias told the sheriff." Rebecca felt a chill of apprehension. "Please, sit down," she offered, gesturing to one of the student desks. "Is everything all right?" Alice perched on the edge of the seat, her hands twisting anxiously in her lap. "The sheriff came to our house, asked Elias about the children visiting you before the storm, said you'd claimed they were here, checking on you." Rebecca's throat tightened. "Mrs. Pembroke, He told them the truth," Alice interrupted, her eyes finally meeting Rebecca's. "That the children weren't anywhere near the schoolhouse that day. They were helping me with laundry at the Johnsons' place." She paused, drawing a shaky breath. "The sheriff was very angry. Said Elias was calling you a liar." Guilt and fear coiled in Rebecca's stomach. Her careless lie had placed this family directly in Walter's crosshairs. "I'm so sorry," she began, but Alice raised a hand to stop her. "Miss Miller, I don't know what really happened during that storm, and I don't want to know." Her voice had gained strength, an unexpected firmness beneath the nervous exterior. "But Elias and we talked after the sheriff left, about those poor white children, about how their parents died so suddenly, about how quick the sheriff was to separate them, send them to different homes." She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice though no one else was present. "It reminded us of the Jensen children 3 years back, and the Coopers before that. Always the same pattern. Parents gone, children separated, never attending school regular thereafter." Rebecca remained silent, sensing that Alice had more to say, that this conversation was building toward something significant. "Last night, after the sheriff brought Elias in for questioning, our William overheard something at the livery stable. The sheriff was telling his deputy they needed to search Thompson's ranch, said he was certain the scarred freak was involved somehow." Rebecca couldn't suppress her sharp intake of breath. Walter was indeed connecting the pieces faster than she'd hoped. "They're planning to ride out there after the town meeting," Alice continued, "with enough men to overcome any resistance." She stood abruptly, straightening her worn shawl with dignity. "I thought someone should know, and I want you to know that my back door is always unlocked, should you ever need a quick exit that the sheriff might not immediately notice." The offer of alliance, so unexpected and yet so characteristic of Margaret's quiet defiance of authority, brought sudden tears to Rebecca's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, squeezing the older woman's hand in wordless gratitude. "Now then," Margaret continued briskly, rising from her chair with surprising agility for her age, "I should let you rest. You look about ready to collapse, and tomorrow will bring its own challenges, I've no doubt." At the door she paused, adjusting her shawl against the cold. "One more thing you might find interesting. That scarred rancher, Thompson, isn't it, was seen riding toward town just after dawn, alone. Quite unusual for him to venture out after a storm when most sensible folks stay home." With that parting morsel of information, Margaret departed, leaving Rebecca standing in the doorway, her mind racing with new possibilities and fears. Daniel had been riding toward town this morning after she'd watched him head north with the children. Why would he take such a risk, exposing himself to potential encounter with Walter or his men? Unless he'd been establishing a false trail of his own, creating evidence that he had indeed left the schoolhouse at dawn, heading in a direction that would draw attention away from Whispering Pines. A calculation based on the likelihood that Walter would eventually discover his presence during the storm, despite Rebecca's efforts to conceal it. The realization of how thoroughly Daniel had considered all contingencies, how carefully he'd constructed layers of protection for the children, left Rebecca momentarily breathless with admiration and concern. Because if Walter encountered Daniel in town, questioned him directly about his whereabouts during the blizzard, no, Daniel was too intelligent, too experienced at navigating difficult situations to allow himself to be cornered. He would have a story prepared, alibis established. The brief appearance in town was likely deliberate, designed specifically to be witnessed and reported. Still, the knowledge that he had taken such risks, possibly endangering himself to protect her credibility, added a new weight to Rebecca's shoulders. She had responsibilities now that extended beyond her own safety, to the children who trusted her, to Daniel, who had placed his faith in her discretion, even to Margaret, who had offered alliance without demanding explanations. Rebecca closed the door against the gathering twilight, her decision crystallizing in the quiet of her small home. She would maintain the facade as long as possible, diverting Walter's attention from Whispering Pines through carefully placed misinformation. But she would also prepare for the possibility of discovery, gathering what she might need for a swift departure if circumstances demanded it. The game had grown more complex, the stakes higher than she had initially understood, but Rebecca Miller had never been one to abandon a challenge once undertaken. She had promised those children protection, had given Daniel her word. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same quiet courage that had sustained her through years of Walter's petty tyrannies and Pine Creek's judgmental scrutiny. Outside, snow began falling again, soft and silent, gradually erasing the day's footprints from the world. Rebecca watched it through her window, finding unexpected comfort in nature's indifference to human concerns. The snow fell on Walter's property and Daniel's alike, covered the tracks of the innocent and guilty without discrimination. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions. But tonight, at least, Rebecca allowed herself to hope that somewhere, to the north, beyond Walter's immediate reach, 2 children were safe and warm, sheltered by a man whose scars told only part of his story. 3 days passed with agonizing slowness. Rebecca maintained her routine, teaching classes, grading papers, nodding politely to townspeople who inquired about her experience during the blizzard. She crafted her answers carefully, combining truth and fiction into a seamless narrative that revealed nothing of importance while appearing to disclose everything. Yes, she had sheltered the white children during the worst of the storm. No, she had no idea where they might have gone after leaving the schoolhouse. Yes, it was terribly concerning. Perhaps they had found other assistance elsewhere. While she watched and waited, Walter's men continued their search, expanding outward from town in concentric circles. They questioned farmers, trappers, even the station master at the railway depot 10 miles south. Rebecca heard whispers that the sheriff had dispatched riders to neighboring settlements, offering rewards for information about the missing orphans. What she didn't hear were any rumors about Whispering Pines Ranch or Daniel Thompson. If Walter suspected the scarred rancher's involvement, he kept those suspicions private. Perhaps because challenging Daniel meant confronting a man whose resources and influence rivaled his own, or perhaps because he truly hadn't connected the pieces yet. Each night, Rebecca stood at her cottage window, gazing northward toward the distant hills that concealed Daniel's property. Were the children settling in? Did they have warm beds, enough food? Was Daniel reading to Charlotte before sleep, as he had that one evening in the schoolhouse, his deep voice softening over the simple words? These thoughts occupied her mind as she walked home from school on the third afternoon, her path taking her past the general store where several men had gathered on the porch. Their conversation halted abruptly as she approached, replaced by a pointed silence that raised the hairs on her neck. "Afternoon, Miss Miller," Tom Jenkins called, his greeting overly loud and forced. The others nodded stiffly, their eyes following her with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. "Mr. Jenkins," she acknowledged, quickening her pace slightly. "Gentlemen." She felt their stares until she rounded the corner, her heart beating faster than the brief interaction warranted. Something had changed. She could feel it in the air, in the sudden tension that surrounded her presence. Margaret Wilson's cats were sunning themselves on the front step of the elderly woman's house as Rebecca passed. The door opened before she reached her own cottage. "Rebecca," Margaret called, her voice carrying the deliberate casualness of urgent warning. "I've just made a fresh pot of tea. Won't you join me for a cup?" The invitation was transparently strategic, but Rebecca accepted, with equal pretense of normalcy. "That sounds lovely, Margaret. In case it matters to anyone." The warning was delivered with careful ambiguity, allowing Alice deniability if questioned later, while ensuring Rebecca understood the critical information. Walter wasn't just planning to confront her at the meeting. He was preparing to raid Whispering Pines immediately afterward, potentially catching Daniel and the children completely unprepared. "Thank you, Mrs. Pembroke," Rebecca said quietly. "This information is valuable." Alice nodded once, her message delivered. "We'll see you at the meeting then, Miss Miller. Elias says we should all stand together no matter what the sheriff claims." With that surprising statement of solidarity, she slipped out the door as quietly as she had entered. Rebecca stood frozen for several moments after Alice's departure, the implications of this new information cascading through her mind. Walter was moving faster and more aggressively than she had anticipated. The town meeting wasn't just an attempt to pressure her. It was a distraction designed to keep her occupied while his men prepared to descend on Whispering Pines. She needed to warn Daniel immediately, but how? Jim Holloway had risked exposure coming to town once. She couldn't expect another such visit, especially with Walter's surveillance intensifying, and she couldn't leave herself, not without confirming Walter's suspicions and potentially accelerating his plans. Rebecca gathered her belongings with trembling hands, her mind racing through options and discarding them just as quickly. As she secured the schoolhouse and began the walk back to town, a desperate plan began to form. It was risky, dependent on timing and luck, but it might be the only way to alert Daniel before Walter's men arrived at the ranch. The main street of Pine Creek was unusually busy for a weekday afternoon. People clustered in small groups outside the general store and post office, their conversations falling silent as Rebecca passed. She nodded politely, maintaining her composure despite the weighted stares and whispered comments that followed in her wake. Margaret Wilson waited on her, porch, watching Rebecca's approach with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Town's buzzing like an overturned beehive," she observed, as Rebecca paused at her gate. "Sheriff's been busy spreading his particular brand of concern." "So I've noticed," Rebecca replied quietly. "May I speak with you privately for a moment?" Inside Margaret's parlor, with the door firmly closed, Rebecca quickly relayed what Alice Pembroke had told her. Margaret's weathered face grew increasingly grave as she absorbed the information. "That changes matters considerably," the elderly woman said when Rebecca finished. "Simmons isn't just after you. He's building towards something larger, using the meeting to keep the town distracted while he pursues his real target. I have to warn them," Rebecca said. "Somehow, before Walter and his men arrive." Margaret considered this, her fingers tapping thoughtfully against the arm of her chair. "The meeting's at 7, Town Hall. That gives us just over 2 hours. "Us?" Rebecca questioned, surprised by the pronoun. A spark of mischief lit the older woman's faded eyes. "Did you think I'd let you handle this alone, child? I've been waiting 73 years for a proper adventure." She rose with surprising agility for her age. "Now then, this is what we're going to do." The plan they crafted over the next hour was audacious in its simplicity. Margaret would attend the town meeting as expected, positioned near the main exit where she could observe both Rebecca and Walter. Rebecca would arrive precisely on time, neither early nor late, drawing no additional attention to herself. As the meeting progressed, Margaret would create a diversion, a sudden fainting spell that she assured Rebecca she could convincingly simulate, having practiced extensively during her youth to escape tedious social obligations. During the ensuing commotion, Rebecca would slip out the side entrance that led to the narrow alley behind the town hall. "My grandson, Thomas, keeps his horse tethered behind the blacksmith shop on meeting nights," Margaret explained. "He won't mind if you borrow it for an urgent errand. The boy owes me for paying his gambling debts last spring anyway." "But Walter will notice my absence immediately," Rebecca pointed out. "He'll send men after me." "Not if he believes you're helping me home," Margaret countered. "I'll make certain he sees you assisting me toward the door. After that, it's a simple matter of Mrs. Jenkins, who owes me several favors involving her late husband's more colorful indiscretions, confirming she saw you taking me home if anyone inquires." The deception wouldn't hold for long, perhaps. 20 minutes at most, but it might provide just enough time for Rebecca to reach the northern trail and send warning to Daniel before Walter's men were mustered and mounted. "And the document?" Margaret asked, nodding toward Rebecca's pocket where the affidavit now resided. "Will you use it?" Rebecca hesitated. "Only as a last resort," she decided. "If I can warn Daniel in time, there may be no need to reveal it at all." Margaret studied her with shrewd eyes that saw more than Rebecca was entirely comfortable with. "You've grown fond of this scarred rancher and his charges, haven't you?" The directness of the question caught Rebecca off guard. "I've only known him a few days," she protested, "barely more than strangers brought together by circumstance." "Circumstance has a way of revealing character more quickly than years of ordinary acquaintance," Margaret observed, "and shared adversity often creates bonds that comfortable society cannot." Rebecca couldn't deny the truth in the elderly woman's words. Something had formed between her and Daniel during those hours in the schoolhouse, a connection based on mutual respect and shared purpose that transcended conventional acquaintance. Whether it might develop into something more remained to be seen, but she couldn't pretend it didn't exist. "I admire his courage," she admitted quietly. "His willingness to help children he didn't know, to risk his reputation and safety for what he believed was right." "And perhaps," Margaret suggested gently, "he admires similar qualities in you." Before Rebecca could respond to this observation, the town clock chimed 6. reminding them that time was running short. She needed to return to her cottage, change into suitable attire for the meeting, and mentally prepare herself for what lay ahead. "Be careful, child," Margaret said, as Rebecca prepared to leave. "Walter Simmons is a dangerous man when crossed. He values his pride above all else, and you've wounded it deeply." "I know," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "But some things are worth the risk." The elderly woman nodded approvingly. "Indeed, they are. Now go. We both have preparations to make if our performance is to be convincing tonight." Rebecca hurried home, her mind filled with details of their plan and all the ways it might go wrong. What if Walter stationed men at all exits? What if Margaret's diversion failed to create sufficient commotion? What if Thomas's horse wasn't where it should be, or was too difficult for her to control? So many variables, so many potential points of failure. Yet the alternative, doing nothing while Walter and his men descended on Whispering Pines, potentially separating the children again and arresting Daniel, was unthinkable. At her cottage, Rebecca changed quickly into her second-best dress, a serviceable brown wool that wouldn't draw attention but was sturdy enough for riding if necessary. Beneath it, she wore her warmest underthings and sturdiest boots. Into one pocket went Daniel's revolver, into the other, the folded affidavit that represented her last resort. As a final preparation, she wrote a brief note explaining the situation and Walter's plans for the raid. If she couldn't reach Whispering Pines herself, perhaps she could at least get this warning to someone who could deliver it in time. The town hall was already 3/4 full when Rebecca arrived, slipping into a seat near the side door as planned. The atmosphere crackled with tension and anticipation, not the usual bored resignation of mandatory civic gatherings, but the electric expectancy of promised drama. Walter stood at the front of the room, engaged in what appeared to be serious conversation with Mayor Brooks and several town council members. He didn't look directly at Rebecca when she entered, but she felt his awareness of her presence like a physical pressure. Across the room, Margaret Wilson nodded almost imperceptibly, confirming their plan remained in place. Nearby, Elias and Alice Pembroke sat stiffly upright, their faces set in identical expressions of nervous determination. Rebecca was touched by their unexpected alliance, even as she worried about potential consequences to them if tonight went badly. At precisely 7 o'clock, Mayor Brooks called the meeting to order, his pompous voice echoing in the crowded hall. "Citizens of Pine Creek, thank you for your attendance at this important gathering. Sheriff Simmons has requested this opportunity to address matters of community safety and civic responsibility that concern us all." Walter stepped forward, his badge gleaming in the lamplight, hat held respectfully in his hands in a practiced gesture of authority tempered by humility. He surveyed the assembled townspeople with what he clearly intended as a benevolent but serious expression. "Good people of Pine Creek," he began, his voice pitched to carry to the back of the hall. "I've called you here tonight because our community faces a situation that requires collective vigilance and cooperation." Rebecca felt her pulse quicken as Walter launched into a carefully constructed narrative about the orphaned white children, their tragic circumstances, their vulnerability, and the town's responsibility to ensure their proper care and placement. He described their disappearance from the schoolhouse in terms that stopped just short of direct accusation, emphasizing the dangers faced by children alone in the wilderness. "These innocent young souls need our protection," Walter continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a practiced orator. "They need the structure and guidance that only proper legal placement can provide. Yet someone," his gaze swept the room, deliberately avoiding Rebecca's corner, "has taken it upon themselves to interfere with this process, to substitute their judgment for the law's." A murmur ran through the assembled townspeople. Walter had their attention now, was skillfully building toward his true purpose. Rebecca glanced at Margaret, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Not yet. Wait for the direct accusation." "I am forced to consider," Walter continued, his voice dropping, to a more intimate tone that compelled his audience to lean forward, "that these children may have been removed from proper authorities by someone with personal motives. Someone who believes they know better than the duly appointed representatives of territorial law." Another pause, another meaningful sweep of his gaze across the room. Rebecca steeled herself for what was coming. Walter was building his case methodically, turning the town against her before making his direct accusation. "In fact," he said, his voice suddenly harder, "I have evidence that suggests deliberate deception was used to conceal these children's whereabouts. False statements were made, witnesses misled." Now his gaze landed directly on Rebecca for the first time, pinning her in place like a butterfly to a collector's board. "Miss Miller," he called, his voice carrying throughout the now silent hall, "would you care to explain to your friends and neighbors why you lied about the Pembroke children visiting the schoolhouse before the storm, or why tracks leading north from the school suggested multiple travelers, not just the two children heading east as you claimed?" All eyes turned toward Rebecca, the collective weight of their stares pressing against her like a physical force. This was the moment, the direct confrontation Walter had been building toward, and according to their plan, it was also Margaret's cue. Right on schedule, the elderly woman gave a theatrical gasp, loud enough to draw attention even from those focused on Rebecca. Margaret's hand flew to her chest, her eyes rolled upward, and she slumped sideways in her chair with convincing suddenness. "Mrs. Wilson!" someone cried. "She's taken ill!" The perfect diversion erupted precisely as planned. People rising from their seats, voices calling for water, for air, for a doctor. Margaret lay limply in her chair, giving an occasional weak flutter of her eyelids for added effect. Rebecca moved quickly, rushing to Margaret's side as if concerned only for her elderly friend. "Give her space," she urged the gathering crowd. "Help me get her outside for fresh air." With the assistance of several concerned citizens, Rebecca supported Margaret toward the main door, making certain Walter could see them clearly. The sheriff's expression betrayed momentary frustration at the interruption of his carefully orchestrated confrontation, but he could hardly object to assistance being rendered to an elderly woman in distress. "I'll take her home," Rebecca announced loudly. "Please continue the meeting. Mrs. Wilson would be upset to think she'd disrupted important town business." Margaret gave a feeble wave that somehow managed to convey both appreciation for the concern and encouragement for the meeting to proceed without her. It was, Rebecca thought admiringly, a masterful performance from a woman who had clearly missed her calling on the stage. They made it through the main doors and down the steps, maintaining the charade until they reached the corner where their paths would diverge. Rebecca toward the blacksmith shop and Margaret ostensibly toward her home, though she had no intention of going there immediately. "Go quickly," Margaret whispered, suddenly standing straight with no sign of her previous collapse. "I'll maintain the deception as long as possible." "Thank you," Rebecca said fervently, "for everything. Don't thank me, child, just succeed." The elderly woman's eyes gleamed with a youthful fire that belied her years. "Now run before that pompous fool realizes he's been outmaneuvered by two women." Rebecca squeezed Margaret's hand once, then slipped into the darkening shadows of the alley, moving swiftly toward the blacksmith shop, where she prayed Thomas Wilson's horse would be waiting as promised. Behind her, the town hall doors remained closed, the meeting presumably continuing, with Walter attempting to salvage his momentum after the interruption. How long before he realized she wasn't returning? How long before he sent men to Margaret's house discovering the deception? Minutes at most. Time enough to reach the horse to begin the journey northward? Perhaps. Time enough to reach Whispering Pines before Walter's raiding party? Unlikely. But she had to try. Had to at least get far enough to intercept someone from the ranch to pass her warning to Daniel before Walter and his men arrived. The children's safety, Daniel's freedom, and her own future now depended on how quickly she could cover the miles between town and Whispering Pines Ranch. Thomas Wilson's gelding was indeed where Margaret had promised, a sturdy brown horse with a white blaze, tethered behind the blacksmith shop. Rebecca approached carefully, speaking softly to avoid startling the animal. She was no expert rider, but had grown up on a small farm where basic horsemanship was a necessary skill. "Easy, boy," she murmured, untying the reins with trembling fingers. "We have an urgent journey ahead." The horse regarded her with mild interest, accepting her presence without alarm. Rebecca gathered the reins, positioned herself beside the mounting block, and with a silent prayer, swung herself onto the saddle. The gelding shifted slightly, adjusting to her weight, but remained mercifully calm. "Good boy," she whispered, gathering the reins properly. "Now let's ride." She turned the horse toward the narrow path that led behind the row of buildings, away from the main street where she might be observed. The back route would take her to the northern edge of town without passing directly in front of the town hall, a small advantage, but perhaps a critical one. As she urged the horse forward, a shout from the direction of the town hall sent a jolt of alarm through her body. Had her absence been discovered so quickly? Rebecca resisted the urge to look back, focusing instead on guiding the gelding toward the trees that marked the beginning of the northern trail. The path narrowed as they left the last buildings behind, forcing Rebecca to slow their pace slightly. Darkness was falling rapidly now, the twilight deepening to true night beneath the canopy of pines. Soon she would need to rely on the horses, superior night vision and instincts, a prospect that both worried and reassured her. Behind her, more shouts echoed from town, multiple voices now, the sound of men being organized, of pursuit being arranged. Walter had discovered her absence sooner than she'd hoped. The chase would begin momentarily. "Faster," she urged the gelding, giving him his head as they reached a straight stretch of trail. "Please, faster." The horse responded willingly, breaking into a canter that ate up the distance with surprising speed. Rebecca leaned low over his neck, her heart pounding in rhythm with his hoofbeats. How far to Whispering Pines? 5 miles? 6? At this pace, perhaps 30 minutes if the trail remained clear and the horse maintained his energy. Would it be enough? Or would Walter's men, more experienced riders on fresher mounts, overtake her before she could deliver her warning? Only time would tell, and time was now her most precious and limited resource. Dawn broke over Whispering Pines Ranch in hues of gold and crimson, as if the sky itself was preparing for the confrontation to come. Rebecca stood at the window of her borrowed room, watching as Walter's men stirred from their overnight positions, stretching stiff limbs and stamping cold feet as they prepared for the day's journey. She had slept better than expected, waking only once in the night to the sound of voices below. Daniel conferring with someone in hushed tones that hadn't carried through the thick floorboards. Now, fully dressed and composed, she steeled herself for what lay ahead. A soft knock at the door announced Mrs. Navarro, Daniel's housekeeper, bearing a tray with coffee and fresh bread still warm from the oven. The older woman's kind eyes assessed Rebecca with motherly concern. "You should eat," she said simply. "The journey to Bozeman is long, and men forget that others need rest and nourishment when they're focused on their battles." Rebecca accepted the tray gratefully. "Thank you. Are the children fed and dressed, though still in their safe place?" Mrs. Navarro confirmed. "The master says they'll remain there until the sheriff's men have cleared the property. Safer that way." This practical precaution made sense. Walter would be watching for any attempt to secretly remove the children. Better they remain hidden until the main party departed for Bozeman. "Mr. Thompson asks that you join him in the study when you're ready." the housekeeper added. "Sheriff's already making noise about leaving, but the master said they'll wait until you've had your breakfast proper." Rebecca smiled at this small act of consideration. Even with the pressure of Walter's men surrounding his home and the looming confrontation with territorial authorities, Daniel was ensuring she wasn't rushed or neglected. Downstairs, she found Daniel in the study, dressed for travel in a heavy coat and practical riding clothes. He looked up from the documents he was organizing, his expression brightening at her appearance. "You slept well?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. "Surprisingly so," Rebecca confirmed, "though I heard voices in the night. Was there news?" Daniel nodded, glancing toward the window where Walter could be seen marshalling his deputies in the yard. "A rider from Helena arrived around midnight. Judge Harmon has indeed returned early from his circuit. He's in Bozeman now, hearing cases at the territorial courthouse." "That's fortunate," Rebecca observed. "Saves us from having to travel further to find him." "Very fortunate," Daniel agreed, though something in his tone suggested this wasn't mere coincidence. "The judge has agreed to hear our case as his first matter this morning. Apparently, concerns about improper placement of orphaned children take priority on his docket." Rebecca studied Daniel's face, once again struck by the extent of his connections and influence. "You knew he would be there," she realized. "This isn't chance at all." A ghost of a smile crossed Daniel's scarred features. "Let's just say I've had some correspondence with the judge over the past few days. He's taking a particular interest in reforming certain practices within the territorial foster system." Before Rebecca could pursue this intriguing revelation, a sharp knock at the front door announced Walter's impatience. Daniel gathered the documents into a leather portfolio, his expression settling into calm determination. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Rebecca squared her shoulders. "As I'll ever be." Walter's expression when they emerged together spoke volumes, suspicion mingled with vindictive anticipation, as if he could already taste victory despite the setbacks of the previous night. He stood flanked by 4 deputies, all mounted and ready to depart. "Finally," he said curtly, "we're burning daylight." Daniel ignored the implied criticism, turning instead to Jim Holloway, who stood nearby. "You know what to do," he said simply. The foreman nodded, understanding flowing between the men without need for elaboration. Once Walter's party departed, the children would be moved from their hiding place to a more comfortable location, still protected but less confined. The journey to Bozeman took nearly 3 hours, the terrain growing more difficult as they approached the larger settlement. Walter insisted that Rebecca ride beside him, separating her from Daniel in what was clearly a deliberate tactic to prevent any collusion or coordination of their stories. "You've made a serious miscalculation," Walter told her at one point, keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Throwing your lot in with Thompson might seem clever now, but when this is over, you'll find yourself with nothing, no position, no home, no reputation." Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "Are you threatening me, Walter? Or simply projecting your own fears onto me?" His jaw tightened at the direct challenge. "I'm stating facts. This community trusted you with their children's education. How do you think they'll react when they learn you've been harboring runaways and lying to their elected sheriff?" It was a valid question, one Rebecca had considered extensively during the long night. Many in Pine Creek would indeed view her actions with suspicion at best, outright condemnation at worst. Her teaching position, already tenuous given Walter's influence, would likely be forfeit regardless of the judge's ruling. "Some things matter more than security," she replied simply. "Like knowing you've done what's right, even when it costs you." Walter's expression shifted, a flicker of something almost like regret crossing his features before hardening again into determination. We'll see how comforting those noble sentiments are when you're facing the consequences. Bozeman greeted them with the bustle of a growing territorial hub, streets filled with wagons and riders, businesses opening for the day's trade, the railway station, disgorging passengers and freight in equal measure. The territorial courthouse stood near the center of town, its solid stone construction a statement of permanence and authority. Judge Clayton Harmon was a surprise, younger than Rebecca had expected, perhaps 45, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to evaluate and catalogue everything they observed. He received their unusual party in his chambers rather than the open courtroom, an accommodation that visibly irked Walter but appeared to satisfy Daniel. "Gentlemen, Miss Miller," the judge acknowledged, taking his seat behind a broad desk piled with legal texts and documents. "I understand we have a matter regarding the placement of orphaned minors." Walter stepped forward immediately, presenting his case with practiced authority. The white children orphaned by tragedy, legally wards of the county, removed from proper placement processes by interference from Rebecca and harbored unlawfully by Daniel Thompson. The judge listened without interruption, making occasional notes on the paper before him. When Walter finished, emphasizing the importance of maintaining proper legal procedures and authority, Judge Harmon turned to Daniel. "Mr. Thompson, your response to these allegations." Daniel presented their case with equal precision, but added elements Walter had conveniently omitted. The sheriff's documented pattern of separating siblings, placing children in situations amounting to indentured servitude, and prioritizing the convenience of his associates over the welfare of the children themselves. Throughout this presentation, Rebecca watched Walter's face darken with suppressed fury. When Daniel produced affidavits from families whose children had been similarly placed, the sheriff could no longer contain himself. "These are baseless accusations," he snapped. "Hearsay and rumor twisted to undermine legitimate county authority." Judge Harmon raised an eyebrow at the outburst. "Sheriff Simmons, you'll have opportunity to address these points in due course. For now, I'd ask you to extend Mr. Thompson the same courtesy of uninterrupted presentation that I extended to you." Chastened, but still seething, Walter subsided. Daniel continued, explaining the children's discovery during the blizzard, their fear of separation, and his decision to provide sanctuary while seeking proper legal review of their situation. "Which brings us to this hearing today," he concluded. "I filed formal application to be appointed guardian for both children, keeping the siblings together in a stable home where they'll receive education, proper care, and the emotional support they need after their tragic loss." Judge Harmon turned to Rebecca next. "Miss Miller, as the children's teacher, and apparently the first to encounter them after their parents' passing, what is your assessment of their needs and best interests?" Rebecca spoke from her heart, describing Mason's protective devotion to his sister, Charlotte's vulnerability and gradual recovery under proper care, and their mutual terror at the prospect of separation. "In my professional opinion," she concluded, "keeping them together in a stable environment is essential to their recovery and future well-being. Mr. Thompson has demonstrated both the resources and the commitment to provide that environment." Walter scoffed audibly at this, drawing another sharp look from the judge. "Sheriff Simmons, you seem to have strong feelings about Miss Miller's assessment," Harmon observed. "Perhaps you'd like to elaborate on your objections." "Miss Miller is hardly an impartial witness," Walter replied, barely containing his disdain. "She's clearly formed an attachment to Thompson that colors her judgment, and she deliberately misled official investigation, concealing the children's whereabouts for days. I protected them from a system I knew would harm them." Rebecca countered, meeting Walter's accusation directly. a system you've manipulated repeatedly to serve interests other than the children's welfare. The charged exchange hung in the air between them. Judge Harmon studied both parties thoughtfully before turning back to his notes. I've reviewed the documentation provided by Mr. Thompson regarding previous placements under Sheriff Simmons's authority, he said, shuffling through several papers. Disturbing patterns emerge, particularly regarding separation of siblings and subsequent attendance, or rather, conspicuous lack of attendance at school following placement. Walter shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, those placements were made according to available households willing to take in orphaned children. Sometimes practical considerations necessitate difficult decisions. Practical considerations, the judge repeated slowly. Such as the labor needs of your associates. The financial arrangements detailed in these records. He held up a document that Rebecca recognized from Daniel's collection. The evidence of payments between Walter and certain business owners who had received healthy young workers through his placement program. Walter blanched visibly. I don't know what Thompson has shown you, but any suggestion of impropriety is absolutely documented quite thoroughly, Judge Harmon interrupted, his tone hardening, including sworn statements from 3 families who were separated under your authority, with children subsequently working in establishments owned by individuals who made regular payments to your personal accounts. The silence that followed was absolute. Walter's face had drained of color, his confident demeanor crumbling as he realized the extent of evidence arrayed against him. Rebecca felt no triumph at his discomfort, only sadness that the system meant to protect vulnerable children had been so thoroughly corrupted by one man's greed. Your Honor, Daniel spoke into the silence. Our primary concern remains the welfare of Mason and Charlotte White. Whatever legal consequences might arise from this investigation, the children's immediate placement takes precedence. Judge Harmon nodded approvingly at this refocusing of priorities. Indeed, Mr. Thompson, and based on the evidence before me, I find compelling reason to grant your petition for guardianship, pending standard home evaluation which I will arrange through my office rather than county authorities. He turned to Walter, his expression grave. Sheriff Simmons, you are hereby relieved of authority regarding the White children specifically and all orphan placements generally until a full investigation into these allegations is completed. You will return to Pine Creek and await further instructions from the Territorial Marshal's office. Walter stood rigid with shock and humiliation, his carefully constructed authority dismantled in a single hearing. For a moment, Rebecca feared he might physically protest the ruling, but some remaining sense of self-preservation prevailed. This isn't over, he said, the words directed at Daniel, but his gaze fixed on Rebecca. Not by a long measure. On the contrary, Judge Harmon corrected, your involvement with orphan placement is very much over, Sheriff Simmons. Whether your badge follows suit depends entirely on the Marshal's findings. He turned to Daniel and Rebecca. The children remain in your care, Mr. Thompson. Miss Miller, I'd be interested in your assistance reviewing other recent placements from Pine Creek, given your familiarity with the families involved. Walter stormed from the judge's chambers. Without further comment, his deputies following in confused disarray. Rebecca remained seated, momentarily overwhelmed by the swift resolution and its implications. The children were safe. Walter's authority was curtailed, but her own future remained uncertain at best. Daniel's hand found hers, a brief, reassuring pressure before propriety demanded separation. Thank you, Your Honor, he said formally. We'll await your representative for the home evaluation. Judge Harmon gathered his papers, his manner shifting, from judicial gravity to something more personally engaged. Thompson, that ranch of yours could use a proper school, from what I hear. Several families in the outlying areas struggle to provide consistent education for their children. Daniel, glanced at Rebecca, a question in his eyes that she understood immediately. "I've had some thoughts in that direction myself, Your Honor," he replied, assuming I could find a qualified teacher interested in such a remote position. The judge's gaze moved briefly to Rebecca before returning to Daniel. "I imagine such arrangements could be discussed on your return journey. Now, I have other cases waiting, but I expect regular reports on the white children's progress and Miss Miller's assessment of other affected families." Outside the courthouse, Rebecca blinked in the bright sunlight, still processing all that had transpired. Daniel stood beside her, giving her the space and silence needed to collect her thoughts. "He knew," she said finally. "The judge. He was already investigating Walter, wasn't he?" Daniel nodded. "For some months now. My report about the white children simply accelerated the process and provided additional evidence he needed." He hesitated briefly before adding, "I should have told you earlier about my communications with the judge, but I needed to be certain of his support before involving you further." Rebecca understood the caution, though a small part of her wished he had trusted her with the full scope of his plan. But then, they had been virtual strangers until the blizzard threw them together, strangers joined by common cause rather than established trust. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now," Daniel replied, "we return to Whispering Pines. Tell the children they're safe, that they'll stay together." He paused, studying her face with unusual intensity. "And perhaps discuss that school Judge Harmon mentioned." The implication was clear, an offer of position, purpose and place at Whispering Pines, security after the inevitable loss of her teaching post in Pine Creek. But was it charity, obligation, or something more personal? "Daniel," she began carefully, "I appreciate the offer, but I don't want a position born from pity or obligation. What happened with the children has nothing to do with what I'm asking," he interrupted gently. "Rebecca, when I found you in that schoolhouse during the storm, I discovered someone willing to risk everything for children who weren't hers. Someone who saw past appearances to the person beneath. Someone who stood her ground against intimidation and threat." He took a deep breath, the scarred side of his face tightening slightly with emotion. "Those qualities would make you an exceptional teacher for any school, but they also make you someone I'd very much like to have in my life, in whatever capacity you might consider." The admission, made with such straightforward honesty, caught Rebecca by surprise. Not because she hadn't sensed the connection growing between them, but because she hadn't expected Daniel to acknowledge it so directly, so soon. "I don't know what my place in Pine Creek will be after this," she admitted. "Walter has friends, influence. Even with his authority curtailed, he could make life very difficult. All the more reason to consider alternatives," Daniel suggested. "Not running away, but moving towards something better. For the children, for yourself." A hint of vulnerability entered his expression. "For us, perhaps, in time." Rebecca considered the path that had led her here, from the blizzard to this moment of unexpected possibility. She thought of Mason and Charlotte, of the school Judge Harmon had suggested, of Margaret Wilson, who would doubtless approve of this development with considerable satisfaction. Most of all, she thought of Daniel, the man beneath the scars, who had risked his reputation and security for children he didn't know, who had treated her with respect and consideration from their first meeting, who now offered her not just a position but potential partnership. "I believe," she said slowly, "that Whispering Pines Ranch might benefit greatly from a proper school, assuming the teacher has certain guarantees regarding curriculum and methods." Daniel's smile transformed his face, erasing years of isolation and caution. "I believe those terms could be negotiated to mutual satisfaction, Miss Miller." "Rebecca," she corrected gently, "I think we're well past formalities, don't you?" His hand found hers again, this time without hesitation or concern for appearances. "Rebecca," he agreed, her name carrying warmth and promise in equal measure. They rode back to Whispering Pines side by side, discussing plans for the school, for the children's education, for the future that had opened before them unexpectedly. Walter and his men had departed ahead of them, the sheriff's humiliation making him unwilling to travel in their company. As they crested the final ridge, the ranch spread below them, peaceful in the afternoon light. Rebecca could see figures moving about the yard, ranch hands going about their work, Mrs. Navarro hanging washing on the line, and two smaller shapes that could only be Mason and Charlotte, free from hiding now that Walter's men had departed. "Home," Daniel said quietly, the word carrying layers of meaning beyond its simple syllable. Rebecca smiled, feeling a sense of rightness settle over her. "Yes," she replied, "I believe it is." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. There was someone else here, a man. She forced herself not to flinch from his touch. As I said, I had only the children for company. Then perhaps you'd explain these? Walter gestured toward the floor near the stove, where a set of large boot prints remained visible in the thin layer of ash that had spilled during the night, prints far too large to belong to Mason. Rebecca's mind raced. She'd been so careful to erase signs of Daniel's presence, but had overlooked this simple detail. "A traveler," she admitted, deciding a partial truth was safer than a complete fabrication now. He was caught in the storm as well, sought shelter for the night. Left before the children woke. "How convenient," Walter said, his voice dangerously soft. "And did this traveler have a name?" "He didn't offer one," Rebecca replied, relieved that this, at least, was not a lie. Walter studied her face, clearly searching for signs of deception. His gaze was so intense that Rebecca feared he might somehow see the weight of Daniel's revolver in her pocket or the folded paper with its pine tree symbol. "Those children are wards of the county now," he said abruptly, changing tactics. "Harboring them without official placement is against the law. I didn't harbor them, Walter. I provided emergency shelter during a life-threatening storm, as any decent person would." The implied criticism wasn't lost on him. His eyes hardened. "Those children need to be placed with proper families, separate homes that can provide for their individual needs. Like the Anderson farm, where boys magically never attend school because they're needed in the fields," Rebecca challenged, anger overriding caution. "Or the miller's textile shop, where little girls work 14 hours a day." Walter's face flushed. "You're overstepping, Rebecca. Again, this is official county business, not a schoolmarm's concern." Rebecca straightened her spine. "Children's welfare is every teacher's concern." For a moment, she thought he might strike her. His hand twitched at his side, and the deputies exchanged uncomfortable glances. Instead, he smiled thinly. "We'll find them," he promised. "And when we do, I'll remember who assisted in their disappearance." The threat hung in the air between them, clear and unambiguous. Rebecca maintained her composure with effort, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. "I wish you luck in your search," she said evenly. "Now, if you don't mind, I have lessons to prepare for tomorrow." Walter stared at her a moment longer, then settled his hat back on his head with deliberate slowness. "Deputies," he called to the men by the door, "we'll begin the search along the eastern road toward town. If the children left at dawn, as Miss Miller claims, they can't have gotten far in this snow." His emphasis on the word claims made it clear he didn't believe her story, but was willing to play along for now. As he moved toward the door, he paused beside her. "I'll be back, Rebecca," he said quietly, for her ears alone. And next time, I'll know exactly what questions to ask." Then he was gone, the deputies following in his wake like obedient shadows. Rebecca remained standing until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Only then did she allow her shoulders to sag, her hands trembling as the tension drained from her body. She had bought Daniel and the children some time, precious hours, while Walter searched in the wrong direction. But she harbored no illusions about the reprieve being permanent. Walter Simmons was nothing if not thorough, especially when his pride was at stake. He would eventually expand the search, question neighbors, perhaps even set out for Whispering Pines Ranch if his suspicions led him there. Rebecca moved to the window, gazing toward the northern forest where Daniel and the children had disappeared hours earlier. Were they safe now? Had they reached the shelter of the ranch, or were they still trudging through the deep snow, Charlotte growing tired, Mason trying to be brave? The thought of them out there while Walter's men combed the countryside filled her with fresh anxiety. Perhaps she should have gone with them after all, safety be damned. At least then she would know they were all right. A sudden movement near the tree line caught her attention. A figure emerged briefly from the shadows, then disappeared again, too distant to identify clearly, but distinctly human. Rebecca's heart leapt to her throat. Had Walter left someone behind to watch the schoolhouse? Had he anticipated her deception so completely? She strained her eyes, searching the forest edge, but saw nothing further. Perhaps it had been a trick of light and shadow, or a deer venturing out after the storm. Or perhaps not. Rebecca moved away from the window, suddenly aware of how exposed she was. The schoolhouse, once her sanctuary, now felt vulnerable with its large windows and isolated location. Even her cottage in town would offer little protection if Walter decided to press his interrogation further. For the first time, she fully understood the wisdom of Daniel's parting gifts. Her fingers traced the outline of the revolver in her pocket, then moved to the folded paper with its pine tree symbol, Jim Holloway, Whispering Pines, a potential escape route if things became dire. But not yet.